Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideals are the foundations of the United States of America, or so we are taught. The history of the United States has shown that this was rarely the reality for many Americans. The discriminatory and unconstitutional application of capital punishment illustrates how America uses the lives of prisoners as political pawns. Today I'm going to persuade my audience to support the abolishment of capital punishment in the United States. First, I will go over some of the many problems with the death penalty. Then I will explain the history of the death penalty in the United States. Then I will describe America's current political climate as it relates to the death penalty. Many believe that the death penalty would be a deterrent to people planning on committing crimes such as murder. However, the death penalty has not proven to be a deterrent to crime. On the contrary, murder rates are higher in states with the death penalty. In fact, a study conducted by the Abdurrahman Burahman Center found that after abolishing the death penalty, the murder rates of 11 countries lowered. The study was conducted on 11 countries who abolished the death penalty and followed their murder rates for the 10 years after. These countries, which include South Africa, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Georgia, all experienced a decline in their murder rates. Another major problem with the death penalty is the long history of racial discrimination. One of the ways in which the death penalty is racially discriminatory is based on the victims. The Death Penalty Information Center reported in September 2020 that in 2019, 52% of death row inmates were Black, despite only 13% of the country's population being Black. The New York Times reported on August 3, 2020, that defendants found guilty of killing a white victim were 17 times more likely to be given the death penalty than if the victim were Black. The knowledge of this racial bias is not new. The 1987 Supreme Court case McCluskey v. Kemp ruled that despite evidence of significant racial bias, the death penalty did not violate McCluskey's 14th Amendment right. This 5-4 ruling made it so that in order to protect the defendant's 14th Amendment rights, the court must prove that a police officer, prosecutor, or judge had clear racial discrimination. This ruling made it extremely difficult to prove racial discrimination in the courtroom and has had long-lasting implications on the fight for civil rights as well as the fight against the death penalty. Another argument against the death penalty is deceptively simple. The death penalty is immoral. The death penalty does not seek justice for the victims of the crimes, it seeks vengeance. A study conducted by the University of Minnesota reports that only 2.5% of the victims' friends and families reported that they achieved closure from the execution of their loved one's killer. The same study found that 20% of the friends and families did not feel the execution helped them find closure. The United States also has a gruesome history of botched executions. In his book, Gruesome Spectacles, Botched Executions and America's Death Penalty, political scientist Austin Surratt reported that of the 8,776 executions conducted in America from 1890 to 2010, 276 of those executions were botched. Most recently was the botched and failed execution of Doyle Lee Ham. Ham had advanced lymphatic cancer, which made it nearly impossible to find a vein to inject him. The state was aware of this and had been counseled not to go forward with the execution. They proceeded anyway, which resulted in a failed execution. The attempted execution lasted over 2.5 hours, and Ham was left with 12 puncture marks, which perforated his femoral artery and punctured his bladder. This is just one example of many botched executions conducted by the United States. This type of violence should clearly be considered a cruel and excessive punishment. The 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution states that no cruel or excessive punishment shall be inflicted. However, the United States Supreme Court determined that the death penalty does not violate the 8th Amendment. However, the 8th Amendment does restrict when and how the death penalty can be given. For example, the Supreme Court case Roper v. Simmons ruled that the death penalty is unconstitutional in the case of juvenile offenders. Now that we know the application of the death penalty and the problems with it, let's get some context and history regarding the death penalty. The history of the death penalty in the USA is a long and complicated one. Early American reformers began calling for the abolishment of the death penalty in the 1840s. This resulted in Michigan becoming the first government in the world to abolish the death penalty in 1846. In the early 20th century, 9 states abolished the death penalty. However, after World War I, 5 of those states reinstated the death penalty. The end of the Civil War started the period of Jim Crow in the segregated South. African Americans in America were being falsely accused of crimes and would be violently lynched by mobs of white citizens. The lynchings would often draw large crowds of white families, including children. These horrific lynchings were committed in order to maintain white supremacy and further torment and spread fear among African Americans. These lynchings have a direct impact on our prison and judicial system today, as well as our death penalty. It is important to understand the history of the systemic violence that Black people have faced in this country for context on how our country has and continues to racially discriminate when it comes to capital punishment in the United States. The death penalty, as we know it today, is directly descended from those lynchings and continues to specifically target Black people and specifically Black men in this country. Now that we know the history of the death penalty and what caused our country's current treatment of death row inmates, let's learn more about the American public's perception of the death penalty. The 21st century has shown vast changes in the American public's perception of the death penalty. Polls conducted by Gallup throughout the past 20 years show that as of November 2019, 79% of polled Democrats, 60% of polled independents, and 38% of polled Republicans supported life imprisonment over the death penalty. This is compared to those same numbers in 2014, which was 60% of polled Democrats, 29% of polled Republicans, and 44% of polled independents. These polls show that the public opinion is quickly turning away from the death penalty. A Gallup poll conducted in October 2019 found that public support for life imprisonment has risen to 60%. This is the first time since 1936 where the majority of Americans have supported life imprisonment over the death penalty. Many state governments have taken action against the death penalty and abolished it. 22 U.S. states have abolished the death penalty. Other states, such as California, have governor-issued moratoriums, which means that the governor has the power to suspend any executions. This was recently used by Governor Newsom of California to suspend the executions of the 737 people on death row in California. 2020 marked the first executions carried out in the U.S. in 17 years. Daniel Lee Lewis was the first of the 13 executions that former President Trump rushed in his final 6 months in office. The family of Lee's victims sued the state in an effort to stop the executions, saying, quote, "This is not being done in our name. We do not want this." Trump oversaw more executions than any other U.S. president in history. The public outcry from these executions may have greatly influenced how the country treats the death penalty in the future. President Biden claimed on the campaign trail that he would work to eliminate the federal death penalty. This is historic, as he is the first presidential candidate to support the abolishment of the death penalty and win. This is an extremely critical time in the country regarding the death penalty, as the possibility of abolishing the death penalty is more achievable than ever before. Today, I hope to persuade you to support the abolishment of the death penalty. First, I outlined several of the problems with the death penalty, including the history of racial discrimination, cruel and botched executions, and its lack of effectiveness in quelling crime. Then I went over the history of the death penalty in the United States, as well as the history of racially motivated executions. Finally, I explored the American public's opinions on the death penalty today. I hope that this speech has demonstrated why supporting the abolishment of the death penalty is a critical step this country must take in its fight for civil rights and prison reform. Thank you.